What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you a video about luck in Yu-Gi-Oh! And how luck doesn't really play much of a factor at all when you start to come to terms with the fact that there's so many more things in your control than you might think. I feel like a lot of players, especially the players that might be more inexperienced, tend to use luck as a crutch to basically absolve themselves of responsibility for certain actions that might have resulted in a loss. They might say things like, oh, I lost the die roll, or oh, I bricked, or oh, you know, he top decked the card for the right moment. But when you start to analyze and look at what you could have done in order to help shift probability into your favor, you start to realize that luck really doesn't have any role whatsoever. But before we get into it, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest YouTube channel members as always. So big shouts today to Bill and Richie. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support the channel through a YouTube channel membership, hit the join button down below or check out the links in the description. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Before we get into the meat of the discussion, I feel it's very important to define two very important terms: luck and probability. So luck is defined as success or failure apparently brought by chance rather than through one's own actions. We hear this a lot that, oh, that guy is super lucky, or that guy's really unlucky. It's kind of this force that's out in the ether that people feel has some sort of control in their life in some form or another. But when you match that up against probability, which is more of an objective term, it kind of starts to sound a little bit different. So probability is defined as the extent to which an event is likely to occur. Now, we tend to use probability in the form of percentages, especially when it's down to the deck building process. And probability bleeds down into the deck building process and carries all the way through to actually playing a game against an opponent. Realistically, when you look at Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's just a game of numbers and it's a game of probabilities. The higher your probabilities and the higher your consistency, the more well you're going to do. So when you start to look at events in terms of probability rather than luck, you start to realize that there's a lot more in your control than you might think. So what I want to do is I want to go down a list of some of the most common notions when it comes to luck and how people attribute luck to those failures, and kind of dispel those notions by injecting probability and objectivity to an extent in there to kind of give you guys a different perspective on these scenarios. So I think the biggest one that a lot of people hear all the time is I lost the die roll. Now, in theory, I guess you have a 50% chance to win that die roll before the game even begins. But what if I told you guys there is a 100% chance that you could win the die roll? And that's very simple. If everyone in a particular format wants to go first, if you choose to go second, then, well, you win the die roll 100% of the time, and you're not leaving it to probability whether or not you're going to go first or second. By having that mentality, it then goes down into your deck building process. If you decide, okay, I'm going to make a deck that wants to go second because most of the decks want to go first, because whether there's an FTK prevalent, whether there's a deck that's extra linking, or a deck that's just setting up a board with multiple negations, the theory behind that is if you choose to go second, you're going to design your deck in a way to disrupt your opponent before they're able to set up that board. Then you're going to have full control because you're not leaving it to the die roll as to whether or not you're going to be able to go second to disrupt your opponent and be able to take control of the game from there. We've seen this happen multiple times, and people who've opted to go second in going first formats have been able to top regionals, YCSs. It's something that's a very common thing. And the reverse is true as well, is that when going second is the norm, we saw this with Spiral format, some people opted to build decks to go first in an attempt to disrupt the Spiral player from being able to OTK them. So this has been proven, and it basically shows that you have control to something as simple as the roll of the dice before the game even begins and dictating whether or not you're going to win or lose that game. The next notion is, oh, I drew poorly, or oh, I bricked. And when you start to look at this from a probability perspective, you start to understand that yeah, that's bound to happen, because if you open certain combinations of cards in an opening hand, there's going to be the likelihood that some of those cards don't mesh well together. If you consciously make the effort to play a Brilliant Fusion engine and you have to run a copy of Gem Knight Garnet, there is a statistical probability behind you having that Garnet in your 5-card opening hand, and that's a decision that you made. So there's going to be instances where you brick, but let's say you have someone that you know who goes to a regional, they don't do really well, and they attribute it to the fact that they bricked or they weren't opening well the entire time. Well, they go to another regional and they give the same excuse, and they go to another one, and each and every time they attribute it to the fact that they just bricked every single time. That might be something that that person wants to analyze, because maybe it's not the fact that they were drawing poorly, but maybe it's the fact that they were designing a deck that was not consistent or wasn't consistent enough relative to the other decks that were being played in that current meta, and that's the reason why that player perceived that they were drawing poorly or bricking. If you're playing a less consistent deck relative to all the other decks, or if you're playing an inherently inconsistent deck, then the probability of you drawing poorly or bricking is going to be a lot higher, just as a general rule of thumb. So again, it goes down even to the deck building process, that when you're coming up with certain ratios, when you're using your hypergeometric calculator to come up with these certain combinations and probabilities, that yeah, you have more control over what your hands are going to look like than you might think. The next notion is, oh, my opponent got a lucky top deck. Now, we hear this one all the time, and I really like this one because you can break it down into two separate categories. You can look at it from a perspective of what your opponent did, but also what you did. So let's start with what the opponent did. Maybe your opponent was playing cards or performing specific actions to thin out their deck to increase the probability of top decking one of those outs. It sounds really minor, but by slimming those percentages and slightly increasing those percentages, then they're putting themselves in a better position that if they need a particular card from a particular group in order to be able to out the board, by performing those actions by, let's say, using multiple copies of Terraforming or Foolish Burial Goods to send cards out of their deck, they're heightening those chances in order for them to draw the card that they need. Another example of this is maybe your opponent's playing a deck that has a very high probability of top decking that particular card that would out your field, because if it's an in-engine requirement, well, they probably have 3, 6, 9, maybe even 12 ways to access it. So even though they top decked it, the percentage of them being able to top deck it was actually rather high, so the chance of their success was actually going to be a lot greater than you might think. But let's shift away from the opponent and start to look at the player themselves. Let's say the opponent was in a winning position and, perceived that there was only a particular out or set of outs that was going to basically lose them the game. When it comes to this, you have to realize that maybe that player wasn't playing in an optimal way, that it was going to reduce the probability for their opponent to have those specific cards. So let's say, for instance, going back to what I was just saying, if the particular out in this instance was a card where your opponent has 6 or 9 copies of it when you count maybe terraformings or field spells or however they can access that particular card, if you're not preventing your opponent from being able to activate that card, maybe by setting up specific monsters with negation, or if you're not preparing and weighing the fact that your opponent has a high probability of drawing that particular out, then you're setting yourself up for failure. When you're at this point in the game, you have to realize that you pretty much know a majority of the cards in your opponent's deck. When you see a particular deck or archetype, especially at a high competitive level, you pretty much have a good template of what the standard build of that deck may look like. So you can quickly skim through your head, okay, they have this card, and this card, so I know that these are the cards I need to look out for, and essentially reinforce my field to basically ensure that they won't be able to use any of these cards against me. But what about in other scenarios where your opponent has maybe a one of like Raigeki, and that was the card they needed to top deck in this particular instance. Well, if you're in that winning position, and the only way for you to lose is if your opponent top decks Raigeki, you should basically be performing actions to prevent yourself from losing to a card like Raigeki. I mean, Nightmare Cerberus is a card in the extra deck that prevents all your co-linked monsters from being destroyed by card effects. So if you set up a major co-link, well, Raigeki is going to be absolutely worthless. Another instance is if you're playing a deck with floaters. If you have floaters set up on your field and your opponent top decks Raigeki, well, you're basically blanking the Raigeki, and it's not going to do any good if you're just going to reestablish your entire board once that Raigeki resolves. So there's so many different ways that you can kind of realize that it's not only just in what your opponent did, but also the actions that you performed in that specific game as well that might have led to a particular point. Maybe there was a point in the game where you might have used a specific resource early on, but had you have saved it for later, it might have actually been much more beneficial and could have won you the game rather than lost it. You can get very analytical, and you can just get and pinpoint to these very minor things just to the action of a single card that can ultimately be responsible for you winning or losing a duel. The last notion I wanted to discuss is the mirror match. Now, this is something you hear a lot where when it comes down to a mirror match, it's purely luck as to who draws better that's going to win. And the reason I don't believe this is because this is assuming a lot of things. The first thing this is assuming is that both players playing that deck are playing the exact same build, and I would say in 95% of instances, that's probably not going to be the case. Unless the two players playing in that game worked on the deck together, then most likely they're not going to be the same deck. They might only vary by a few cards, but the variance in those cards could actually make the difference as to whether or not someone wins or loses. But what do I mean by that? Well, maybe one of the players in this instance is playing the more streamlined version of a particular deck, but then the other player is playing a version of the deck that's specifically tailored to beat the mirror match. We saw this with Trickstar Sky Striker and the inclusion of the Mech Knights. The Mech Knights being included into that deck gave anyone playing Trickstar Sky Striker an edge against any other opponent playing in the mirror match, because Mech Knight Purple Nightfall is basically an unkillable card in that matchup and makes it very difficult for a Trickstar Sky Striker player to deal with. So again, even though there's just a tiny variance of a few cards, it can actually make the difference in terms of how two decks perform. Even if you get down to the fact that both decks have the exact same amount of cards, the exact same cards in both lists, you still have to realize that the probabilities are still there and are playing a role. These decks have defined probabilities of how consistent they are, how often they're going to open certain hands, and in the best case scenario, they're actually going to fare rather well against each other, of course depending on what those specific archetypes are, but for the most part, both decks should be designed to do what they do. But again, going back to what I said earlier, probability has built in for the fact that sometimes these decks aren't going to work out. And that's some of the fun of the game in terms of trying to figure out how to skew probability in our favor to start increasing our win percentages and start seeing more victories than defeats. So I really hope you guys learned something from this video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about the notion of there not being any luck in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. And if you found this video informative, consider becoming a YouTube channel member, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.